sometimes you hear these ideas, about where life came from, and they just sound, well, completely wild, like straight out of a sci-fi movie. Theories that maybe something else, something not quite natural, had a hand in evolution.
Right.
And tonight we're diving into one of those ideas, or at least an idea that spawned some wild theories. Symbiogenesis.
Yeah, symbiogenesis itself, the core scientific concept, is actually pretty fundamental in evolutionary biology. It's about how new kinds of life, more complex life, can emerge when different organisms literally merge together.
Merge together, like physically become one.
Exactly. Think of it like evolution through teamwork almost.
Yeah.
Separate things joining forces and becoming something new.
Okay, and the classic example you hear about is our own cells, right? Eukaryotic cells.
That's the big one. The cells that make up, well, us and plants and animals, basically all complex life. The leading theory is they evolved because ancient bacteria started living together.
Like roommates.
Kind of, yeah. One moved inside another, they formed this partnership, and eventually they couldn't live apart. They became organelles inside the bigger cell, like mitochondria.
Mitochondria, the powerhouses. Got it. Okay.
So what we want to do in this deep dive is sort of explore two sides of this. First, the solid science, what symbiogenesis actually means to biologists, the evidence, all that.
Right, the established stuff.
Exactly. But then we'll look at how this idea has been, well, let's say, interpreted or maybe twisted into some really fascinating conspiracy theories based on some of the material you found.
Okay, let's start with the science then. Symbiogenesis isn't some fringe idea in biology, is it?
Oh, not at all. No. It's widely accepted as a really important mechanism in evolution, a key driver, especially for some of the biggest transitions in the history of life. The endosymbiotic theory is really central here.
And that's Lynn Margulis, right? She was the big champion for this.
That's her. Yeah, she really pushed this idea forward back when it wasn't the mainstream view at all.
Faced some pushback, I imagine.
Well, definitely. A lot of skepticism initially, but the evidence, it just piled up over time. It became pretty hard to ignore.
So what does the theory actually propose? You mentioned mitochondria.
Right. So the idea is that organelles like mitochondria and also chloroplasts, the bits in plant cells that do photosynthesis, they weren't always part of the larger cell.
They were separate.
They were once free-living bacteria. Billions of years ago, a larger host cell likely engulfed these smaller bacteria. But instead of digesting them,
it kept them around.
Exactly. They started a symbiotic relationship.
Yeah.
Maybe the little guys provided energy or something else useful, and the host provided shelter. And over millions of years, they became completely integrated, essential parts.
Wow. Okay. What makes scientists so sure about that? What's the evidence?
Well, there are a few key things. Mitochondria and chloroplasts have their own DNA.
Separate from the main DNA in the cell's nucleus.
Yep. It's small, often circular, much like bacterial DNA. And if you compare the genes, they're much closer to certain types of bacteria than they are to the host cell's nuclear genes.
Huh.
Plus, they have their own ribosomes, the machinery for making proteins, and those ribosomes are more like bacterial ones. And they even reproduce inside the cell in a way that looks a lot like bacterial cell division.
That does sound pretty convincing. Okay. You also mentioned something called horizontal gene transfer. How does that fit in?
Right, HGT. So normally genes get passed down vertically, from parent to offspring. Horizontal gene transfer is when genetic material moves sideways between organisms that aren't parent and child. It can happen between different species, even across wide evolutionary distances.
How does that happen? Like, how do genes jump ship?
Various ways. Sometimes viruses carry genes from one host to another. Sometimes cells can just slurp up DNA fragments from their environment, or direct contact between cells. Bacteria do this a lot.
Okay, and this helps with symbiogenesis.
It can, yeah. Imagine two organisms starting a symbiotic partnership. If they can swap some genes horizontally, it might help them integrate their metabolisms or functions more tightly, making the partnership more stable and permanent. It greases the wheels for symbiogenesis, you could say.
So it's like sharing instruction manuals to work better together.
Something like that, yeah.
And the big outcome of all this merging and gene swapping is potentially really fast evolution.
That's a key implication. Instead of just waiting for slow, gradual mutations to accumulate within one lineage, you get two different organisms merging their entire toolkits.
Right.
This can create brand new functions, new capabilities, much, much faster than traditional evolution might suggest. It helps explain some of those periods in Earth's history where we see these apparent bursts of innovation, major new forms of life appearing relatively quickly in geological terms.
like punctuated equilibrium, but driven by these mergers.
Exactly. Evolution isn't always a slow crawl. Sometimes it takes these big leaps forward, powered by cooperation and merging.
Okay. This is where things start to veer off the main road, isn't it? Because this idea of life merging, making big leaps, it sounds like some people have taken that core scientific idea and run with it in a very different direction.
That's putting it mildly, yes. The concept, because it involves these dramatic transformations, has unfortunately become fertile ground for conspiracy theories. People look for explanations, especially for big questions like, where do we come from? And sometimes they look beyond the purely natural.
So how does symbiogenesis get twisted into a conspiracy? What's the core shift in thinking?
The absolute key difference is introducing intent. The conspiracy version says these mergers, these symbiotic events, aren't just happening randomly, driven by natural selection and opportunity.
Guided.
Precisely. Directed evolution. The idea is that some external force, some intelligence, is orchestrating these events, pushing evolution down a specific path using symbiogenesis as the tool.
An external intelligence. Okay, I have a feeling I know where this might be going.
Yep. Buckle up. The most common flavor of this conspiracy theory points the finger squarely at extraterrestrials.
Aliens, of course. So aliens are using symbiogenesis to mess with life on Earth.
That's the core claim, that advanced alien beings have been, or still are, manipulating the evolution of life here, maybe for millennia, by deliberately causing these symbiotic mergers. Engineering life, essentially.
And not just any life, right? They often focus on us.
Very much so. A major thread in these theories is that human evolution specifically wasn't just natural. It was the result of deliberate, orchestrated symbiotic events, maybe even involving the introduction of alien genetic material into our ancestors' lineage.
Wow. Okay. So we're talking about aliens playing cosmic gardeners, maybe splicing their own genes into proto-humans?
That's the kind of territory these theories explore, yes.
And why? What's the supposed goal of these alien evolution meddlers?
Well, the why varies quite a bit, depending on which specific theory you're looking at. But generally, there's this idea of hidden agendas.
Hidden and probably not very friendly agenda?
Often, yes. It ranges from things like controlling humanity, maybe subtly manipulating our development, to perhaps harvesting biological resources from Earth, maybe us, maybe other life, or even preparing the planet for future alien colonization.
Yikes. Okay. So this is a pretty elaborate picture. What kind of evidence, and I'm using air quotes here, do proponents point to?
Right. The evidence is where it gets really problematic from a scientific standpoint. It usually involves taking actual scientific observations or maybe historical mysteries or even myths, and then reinterpreting them through this predetermined conspiratorial lens.
Ignoring the more straightforward scientific explanations along the way.
Almost always, yes. Cherry-picking data or misinterpreting complexity.
Okay, give me some examples. You mentioned the origin of eukaryotic cells, the science part. How does the conspiracy use that?
They look at the fossil record and say, wow, these complex cells seem to appear kind of suddenly. Now, scientists see a long process, even if the fossil record isn't perfectly complete. But the conspiracy take is that it's too sudden, too complex to have happened naturally.
So it must have been designed, engineered by aliens.
That's the leap they make. They interpret that jump in complexity as evidence of deliberate external intervention.
Okay, what else? I've heard people talk about junk DNA. Does that play a role?
It often does. For a long time, scientists didn't know the function of large parts of our genome, the bits that don't directly code for proteins. So it got this unfortunate label, junk DNA.
Which sounds like leftover bits.
Right. And conspiracy theorists jumped on that. They speculated maybe it's not junk. Maybe it's like leftover code from alien genes that were inserted into us ages ago via symbiogenesis.
Even though science is now finding functions for a lot of that non-coding DNA.
Exactly. We now know much of it is crucial for regulating gene activity and other things. But the alien code idea persists in those circles.
Okay. And what about other big evolutionary leaps, things we don't have a perfect fossil trail for yet?
Same pattern. Any gap in our current knowledge, any evolutionary transition that isn't fully mapped out step by step yet, becomes proof.
Proof of alien intervention.
Yep. Instead of seeing it as an area for ongoing scientific discovery, they see it as evidence that natural evolution couldn't have done it, so aliens must have stepped in with some directed symbiogenesis.
It really sounds like a God of the gaps argument, but with aliens instead of God.
That's a very good analogy, actually. Filling the gaps in current scientific understanding with a preferred supernatural or extraterrestrial explanation.
Do they bring in things like ancient myths, too? Stories of gods creating humans?
Oh, absolutely. Ancient astronaut theorists love this stuff. They look at myths from around the world, gods coming from the sky, creating life, modifying humans, teaching skills.
And they say these aren't just myths.
They interpret them as garbled historical accounts, allegories maybe of real events where extraterrestrials visited Earth and used advanced technology, perhaps involving symbiogenesis, to create or alter life, including us.
Instead of, being stories people created to explain the world around them.
Precisely. They discount the cultural and symbolic explanations in favor of a literal, technological interpretation involving aliens.
And what about weird bits of human biology? Our big brains, maybe?
Yes, any trait seen as anomalous or uniquely human sometimes gets flagged. Why do humans have such disproportionately large brains compared to other primates? Why certain genes that seem unique to our lineage?
Alien tinkering.
That's the suggestion. Again, ignoring the perfectly plausible evolutionary explanations involving natural selection favoring intelligence, social complexity, tool use, etc., they prefer the more exotic explanation.
Okay, so if we entertain this idea for a moment, these aliens pulling the evolutionary strings, how are they supposedly doing it? What are the mechanisms they propose for this directed symbiogenesis?
Right, the how. Several ideas get floated. One popular one involves viruses.
Viruses, like the flu.
Sort of, but weaponized, maybe? The idea is that aliens could engineer viruses to act as vectors delivery systems to insert specific, maybe even alien genetic material into target organisms on Earth.
Triggering a symbiotic relationship or altering the organism's evolution.
Exactly, like a genetic payload delivered by a biological missile.
The cosmic Trojan horse you said earlier? Okay, what other methods?
Well, more direct intervention. Genetic manipulation, using highly advanced technology to literally go in and edit the genomes of organisms.
Like CRISPR, but on a planetary scale, wielded by ETs.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
Directly forcing symbiotic relationships or inserting desired traits. Requires some pretty serious tech, obviously.
No kidding. Anything else?
There's also directed panspermia. Panspermia is the general idea that life might spread between planets naturally, like via microbes on meteorites. Directed panspermia is the idea that it's done intentionally. Aliens deliberately seeding Earth with life, or maybe with specifically modified life forms designed to kickstart certain evolutionary pathways, potentially involving a symbiogenesis later on.
Seeding the planet to get the evolutionary ball rolling in a direction they want.
That's the concept.
Okay, so we have the alleged what? Symbiogenesis, the who, aliens, the how, viruses, gene editing, seeding. Let's circle back to the why. What are the most common motives attributed to these alien architects? Why go to all this trouble?
The motives proposed are quite varied, and frankly, often lean towards the sinister, as is common in many conspiracy theories.
Right.
One major theme is genetic experimentation. The idea that Earth, and humanity in particular, is basically a giant lab experiment for some advanced alien race.
We're cosmic lab rats.
In that view, yes. They're studying evolution, maybe testing genetic modifications, and we're the subjects.
Cheery thought. What else?
Resource harvesting. This is another classic trope. Maybe humans, or Earth's unique biology, possess something valuable biological materials, genetic code, maybe even some kind of life energy or consciousness that they want to harvest.
So we're not just rats, we might also be a crop.
That's the unsettling implication in some versions, yes.
Any other potential motives? Seems pretty bleak so far.
There's the colonization angle. Maybe they aren't just experimenting or harvesting, maybe they're preparing Earth for themselves.
Terraforming the planet by tweaking the existing life, including us, to make it suitable for their eventual arrival.
That's one possibility raised. Modifying the biosphere, maybe even humanity, so it aligns with their needs or plans for settlement.
Okay. Is there anything less exploitative?
Well, sometimes you hear more esoteric motives proposed, like guiding our spiritual evolution.
Spiritual evolution?
Yeah, the idea that these aliens aren't necessarily malevolent, but are trying to nudge humanity towards some higher state of being, some predetermined evolutionary or spiritual goal. The nature of that goal is usually pretty vague, though.
Still involves interfering on a massive scale, though, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Whether the supposed motives are scientific, exploitative, or seemingly benevolent, it's all predicated on this idea of large-scale, hidden manipulation.
Okay, let's firmly plant our feet back on the ground now. We've explored the wild side. What are the solid scientific counter-arguments to this entire symbiogenesis conspiracy narrative? Why don't scientists buy the alien angle?
Well, The biggest reason is simply that we have a perfectly good, incredibly well-supported scientific framework already. Evolution by natural selection, mutation, genetic drift, and yes, including natural symbiogenesis.
It explains the data without needing aliens.
Exactly. Established evolutionary theory provides a robust, evidence-based explanation for the diversity of life, including complex transitions. It works. It doesn't require us to invent hidden, intelligent manipulators for which there's zero verifiable evidence.
And the actual evidence, we do have fossils, genetics.
It overwhelmingly supports the natural evolutionary narrative. The fossil record shows gradual changes over vast timescales, even if there are gaps. Genetics reveals the mechanisms of inheritance, mutation, gene duplication, and yes, horizontal gene transfer and the integration of symbionts like mitochondria.
All fitting within a natural framework.
Right. The evidence used by the conspiracy theories, as we discussed, typically involves misinterpreting this data, misunderstanding the processes, or focusing only on anomalies while ignoring the mountain of confirming evidence for natural evolution.
So it's not that science has all the answers right now.
Of course not. There are always details being worked out, new discoveries refining our understanding. But the scientific approach is to seek natural explanations based on testable hypotheses and evidence.
Which brings us to Occam's razor, doesn't it?
It really does. Could you remind us what that principle is about?
Sure. Occam's razor is basically a rule of thumb that says if you have competing explanations for something, all else being equal, the simplest one is usually the better one to start with, the one that makes the fewest new assumptions.
And in this case?
Well, explaining life's history through known, observable natural processes like mutation, selection, and natural symbiogenesis is vastly simpler than inventing undiscovered aliens with unknown technologies and unknowable motives who've been secretly manipulating global evolution for billions of years.
Precisely. Natural evolution is the simpler, evidence-supported explanation. The alien intervention hypothesis requires extraordinary claims with, frankly, no credible evidence.
So wrapping this up, we've looked at symbiogenesis from two very different angles.
Yeah, on one hand, it's a fascinating and fundamental scientific process. Real, documented, explaining major steps in evolution, like our own complex cells.
And on the other hand, it's become the jumping-off point for this elaborate conspiracy theory involving aliens directing evolution from behind the scenes.
A theory which, it's really important to stress, lacks any real scientific support. It's speculation built on misinterpretations.
But it definitely shows how captivating these big questions are, doesn't it? Where did life come from? Are we alone? People are drawn to narratives that offer grand, sometimes hidden answers.
It absolutely does. It highlights that powerful intersection of genuine scientific discovery and the boundless capacity of human imagination, for better or worse. We want explanations. We want stories.
And it really underlines why critical thinking is so important. We need to be able to look at these ideas, separate the evidence-based explanations from the purely speculative narratives, however exciting those narratives might sound.
Couldn't agree more. Understanding the science of symbiogenesis gives us incredible insights into life's actual amazing journey. Understanding the conspiracy theory, well, that tells us more about human psychology and our search for meaning, perhaps.
A fascinating journey through both science and speculation. Definitely leaves you thinking about how we make sense of our own existence.